Hello and welcome to another edition of your most authoritative news and current affairs talk show, China Now. My name is Makiza Micheline Latifa. Let's head straight into China currents with Kris. In this episode, we'll talk about China's latest efforts in striving for peace in Palestine, as Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has held discussions with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, as well as the foreign ministers of Iran and Turkey, with regards to the current tense situation of oppression currently suffered by the Palestinian people in the midst of the genocidal offensive launched by Israel against the Gaza Strip. A lot of emphasis was laid on China's stance in all of this, and Kris will give you all that update. He'll also bring you some updates on the Chinese economy, as China's Commerce Minister Wang Wentao met with Apple's CEO Tim Cook in Beijing on Apple's development in China and the Sino-U.S. trade relations. Stay tuned for more details.
China Currents is a weekly news talk show from China to the world. We cover viral news about China every week and also give you the newest updates on China's cutting-edge technologies. Let's get started. Hi, welcome to China Currents. I'm Kris. Let's start this episode by updating you China's latest effort in striving for peace in Palestine. Between October 14th and 16th, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi held discussions with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, as well as the Foreign Minister of Iran and Turkey, regarding the current tense situation in the Middle East. Wang Yi emphasized that China's stance represents a just position and is a demonstration of China's responsible approach. China has no self-interest in the conflict and has consistently stood on the side of peace, fairness, and justice. Wang pointed out that in response to this severe situation in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, China believes that an immediate ceasefire is of paramount importance. China will provide urgent humanitarian assistance to the Gaza Strip and the Palestinian National Authority through the United Nations. Wang Yi stated that the root cause of the Palestinian issue lies in the historical injustice suffered by the Palestinian people, which has yet to be rectified. China believes that only with the full implementation of the two-state solution can genuine peace be achieved in the Middle East. But sometimes things just won't go by the good wishes. On October 16th, the UN Security Council failed to pass a Russian resolution that called for a humanitarian ceasefire between Israel and Palestinian Hamas in Gaza. The draft Russia proposed also called for hostage release, humanitarian aid, and safe evacuation of civilians. Yet, 3 of the 5 Security Council permanent members, the US, France, and Britain, vetoed the draft, while Japan also voted against it. Similarly, 3 days later, US also vetoed a Brazilian draft on ceasefire and humanitarian aids. As one of the permanent members, China voted in favor of both resolution drafts. After the drafts were rejected by the Security Council, China's Foreign Aid Agency announced that China is now providing emergency humanitarian assistance to both the UN Refugee Agency in Palestine and the Palestinian Authority. China's focus will be on meeting the urgent need for food, medical supplies, and housing in the war-torn Gaza. China's support of the Palestinian cause can be traced back to the Mao era. Through the 60s to 70s, Chinese government had openly supported the Palestinian cause as a fellow liberation movement. After establishing diplomatic relations with Israel in 1992, China remains its alignment with Arab countries and advocates for a two-state solution based on the 1967 boundaries. With the recent escalation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, China increased its diplomatic efforts to mitigate the situation, including engaging with the US, Iran, and Saudi Arabia over the past weekend. In a phone talk with his Saudi Arabian counterpart, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi stated that Israel has gone beyond self-defense, calling Israel to stop collective punishment of the people in Gaza. Next up, the biggest political news in China last week was the Third Belt and Road Forum for International Cooperation. Opened on October 18th, representatives from 140 nations and 30 international organizations have gathered at the forum, which marks the 10th anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative. Notably, Russian President Vladimir Putin is among the attendees and addressed the audience following President Xi Jinping's speech. President Xi outlined 8 key points aimed at achieving long-term high-quality growth. These points include the establishment of a logistics corridor across Europe and Asia, the creation of the Silk Road e-commerce zone, backed by free trade agreements and investment treaties, a US $47.8 billion financing pledge from China's development banks, a focus on green development practices, commitments to scientific developments and artificial intelligence, efforts to enhance cultural and people-to-people exchanges, and a push for clean cooperation to improve transparency and establishment of Belt and Road institutions. As the Belt and Road Initiative enters a new phase, it is expected to further deepen regional and international cooperation, promote sustainable development, and contribute to the common prosperity of the Belt and Road Initiative countries. On Chinese internet, many netizens believe that China will further enhance its global influence and show a brand new model of development and cooperation to the world. The Belt and Road Forum was concluded in Beijing on October 18th, with a total of 458 cooperation agreements were reached. Among them, 89 are multilateral cooperation outcome documents and 369 are practical cooperation projects. Here are a few examples of the forum's achievements and announcements. During the opening ceremony, President Xi Jinping declared the complete elimination of restrictions on foreign investment in the manufacturing sector. This comes after China opened many sectors and used a negative list approach in pilot free trade zones to open up manufacturing. The comprehensive opening of the manufacturing industry on the 18th is seen as a crucial signal of China's economic transformation. China's manufacturing industry has transitioned from the middle and low end to the middle and high end in the global production supply and value chains. This full-scale opening is positive news for the global economy, particularly for the manufacturing sector, commented Wei Jianguo, Vice Chairman of the Chinese Center for International Economic Exchanges and former Vice Minister of Commerce. The complete elimination of foreign investment restrictions in the manufacturing sector sends several key signals. It signifies China's ambition to become a manufacturing powerhouse, solidifying its position in the global industrial supply chains. And further, China's future economic development will remain relying on the manufacturing sector. This is a departure from the path taken by major Western countries, which gradually shifted towards the service sector and underestimated manufacturing, demonstrates China's strong foundation and support in the manufacturing industry. Going forward, China will continue to enhance its manufacturing industry while developing the service sector, ensuring strength in both aspects. On the same day, China's National Bureau of Statistics announced that the country's GDP for the first 3 quarters of the year reached over 90,000 billion yuan, with a year-on-year growth rate of 5.2% at constant prices. Besides the opening up in manufacturing, President Xi also mentioned AI. President Xi Jinping put forward a global initiative on AI governance at the opening ceremony of the Third Belt and Road Forum. He comprehensively elaborated on China's approach to governing artificial intelligence, focusing on its development, security, and governance. The main points include AI brings opportunities and risks. Governance is needed to maximize benefits and address challenges. Countries should build consensus on AI governance through dialogue and cooperation. Key principles: people-centered, peaceful purposes, shared benefits, mutual respect, ethics first. Actions needed: information sharing, ethical guidelines, laws and regulations, risk assessments, UN coordination. Goal is to develop governance frameworks to make AI secure, reliable, controllable, and equitable. Inclusiveness is important. Developing countries should have equal rights and opportunities in AI. International cooperation was, of course, another important element of the Belt and Road Forum. On October 17th, China and Serbia officially signed a free trade agreement in a ceremony witnessed by Chinese President Xi Jinping and Serbian President Vučić. with Chinese Minister of Commerce Wang Wentao and Serbian Minister of Internal and Foreign Trade Miloš Momirović representing their respective governments. This agreement is the first FTA signed between China and a Central and Eastern European country, making Serbia China's 29th FTA partner. The signing of the China-Serbia FTA is an important step in implementing the consensus reached by the leaders of the two countries and serves as a key achievement of the Third Belt and Road Initiative International Cooperation Summit. Negotiations for the China-Serbia FTA were launched in April 2023 and were substantially concluded by the end of September. The agreement aims to establish a high degree of mutual openness between China and Serbia and create new institutional arrangement for bilateral economic and trade cooperation. It also aims to create a more favorable, convenient, transparent, and stable business environment for enterprises from both countries, while injecting a new momentum into high-quality construction of the Belt and Road Initiative. After signing the agreement, both sides will follow their respective domestic procedures to facilitate its early implementation and enforcement. Next up, on October 20th, Chinese President Xi Jinping met with Vietnamese President Ba Ban Tong at Great Hall of the People. President Ba was in China to attend the Third Belt and Road International Cooperation Summit. President Xi expressed his pleasure in meeting President Ba, who's making his first visit to China since assuming office. He extended a warm welcome and asked President Ba to convey his sincere greetings to Nguyen Phu Trong, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Vietnam. The relationship between China and Vietnam is complex and multifaceted. Despite historical conflicts, the countries have developed a strong trade relationship. China is Vietnam's largest trading partner, and Vietnam is China's second largest trading partner in ASEAN. In their meeting, both leaders agreed to uphold the principles of mutual consultation, joint construction, and shared benefits. They plan to take full advantage of their geographical proximity and complementary industries to accelerate the alignment of the Belt and Road Initiative with Vietnam's two-corridor and one economic circle plan. This collaboration aims to better serve their respective developments and benefit the people of both countries. Next up, economy. On October 18th, China's Commerce Minister Wang Wentao met the Apple Chief Executive Tim Cook in Beijing and discussed Apple's development in China and also the Sino-U.S. trade relationship. Minister Wang Wentao highlights that China welcomes Apple, along with multinational companies, to benefit from the country's market and engage in a win-win development. Last but not least, let's take a look at the aftermath of the Fukushima nuclear water dump. On October 16th, the IAEA invited scientists from Japan, China, South Korea, and Canada to jointly collect seawater samples around the Fukushima nuclear plant. Their efforts are expected to contribute further transparency to Japan's sea monitoring promise. The IAEA organized team will visit Japan on October 23rd. They also collect samples of the seabed sediment and fish to compare the levels of tritium and other radioactive substances from those taken last year. According to reports made by the plant operator Tokyo Electric Power Company, no abnormal levels of tritium and other radioactive substances have been detected in the seawater or fish samples collected from around the nuclear plant until September 11th. The IAEA will compare the results of the tests to check whether and how much the outcome of the Japanese test is trustworthy. That's all for today. Thank you for watching this episode of China Currents. If you have any thoughts and comments about our show, please reach us at email address below. I'm Kris. Looking forward to hearing from you and see you next time.
Next up is Threshold with Lisa, where we bring you details of some of the most advanced technological innovations in China. There's a series of updates for you on this segment of the show, and they include stories on the US's latest clampdown on AI chip exports to China. Also, China is planning to build the world's largest underwater telescope to detect ghostly neutrons by 2030. Also coming up on Threshold this morning, we'll talk about climate change, which is an urgent global issue. A seasonal shift in super typhoons can be attributed to human-induced greenhouse gas emission. Lisa has details of these and many other exciting technological innovations happening in China. Stay tuned.
Hi, I'm Lisa, and this is Threshold in China. Today we are going to share some exciting tech innovations and announcements that happened in China last week. On October the 17th, the US Commerce Department announced new restrictions on exporting cutting-edge AI chips in order to prevent China from acquiring sophisticated semiconductors and making, quote, breakthroughs in artificial intelligence and supercomputing. The ban will take effect in 30 days. This severely constrains NVIDIA and other chip makers from selling high-performance semiconductors to China. It is also increasingly difficult for companies to find workarounds to bypass these restrictions. For Chinese tech giants already engaged in the AI race, graphic processing units (GPUs) from companies like NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel have become indispensable for training large AI models. According to reports, NVIDIA relies on China for up to 25% of its data center chip revenue. Its share price, along with AMD and Intel, plunged after announcement of the new rules. After last year's restrictions were announced, NVIDIA designed special low-performance GPUs for China, the H800 and A800 series, that skirted the performance threshold set by the US government while retaining enough power to train AI models. Well, most of these are now also banned. Additionally, Intel's Gaudi 2 AI accelerated chip is also affected by the new restrictions.
Even the new high-end RTX 4090 graphics card will require additional licensing for export to China.
Last year's rules prohibited exporting chips above two thresholds, a power threshold that determined the chip's compute capabilities and a threshold for inter-chip communication speed. Now, the Commerce Department will replace the latter with a measure called performance density, specifically designed to prevent workaround. For example, chiplet allowed smaller chip components to be connected and form a complete chip, and the US is concerned that the Chinese firm could acquire chiplet and secretly assemble them into larger chips that violate the restrictions. The updated rules expand restrictions on exporting chip-making tools and equipment to China. Certain Chinese companies were added to Washington's Entity List, a list that already includes major Chinese companies like Huawei and top memory chip maker like Yangtze Memory. This time, they added companies like Biren and Moore's Threads. Well, Biren and Moore's Threads focus on designing GPUs and are considered to be the top candidates for producing domestic alternatives to NVIDIA chips in China. These chips are needed to train algorithms that power AI-based services similar to ChatGPT. With the new restrictions, Biren and Moore's Threads will now face plunging demand and slow technological development. Experts say that this could affect the normal operation of their businesses. With US chips now banned in China, industry experts believe that Chinese firms will have to strive to fill the void by developing homegrown solutions. US chip companies strongly resent that bans could spur the development of an ecosystem led by competitors. In other words, blocking access would accelerate the growth of Chinese domestic chip industry. Given the current geopolitical economy, Chinese startups and industries have no choice but to conduct independent research on architectures and ecosystems synchronized with domestic EDA design tools and mature foundry process. Ultimately, this solution benefits Chinese firms like Huawei while putting multinationals like NVIDIA at a disadvantage. Chinese scientists have bold plans to build a huge underwater telescope to detect neutrinos, ghostly particles that can reveal the secrets of the universe. It is a project called Trident and it aims to build the world's biggest neutrino detector by 2030. Neutrinos are subatomic particles with no charge and almost zero mass. They are produced in cosmic events like exploding stars and black holes. Neutrinos can travel across space unaffected by magnetic fields or matter. They can point back to cosmic ray sources. So, the new telescope will act as a neutrino lens to peer into the universe. But why build this telescope on the water? Giant detectors in very quiet environment are needed to capture rare neutrino interactions. On land, cosmo ray detectors suffer as too much interference to capture them. But with the depths of the seawater and its darkness, the quietness, it allows neutrinos to be detected as they collide with water molecules in a flash of light. Existing neutrino telescopes are in Antarctica, the Mediterranean, and Russia. Trident will be in the South China Sea. The development is led by Shanghai Jiaotong University. The telescope will have 10,000 times the sensibility of the Ice Cube telescope in Antarctica, spanning 4 kilometers on the seafloor at a depth of 3 kilometers. This underwater behemoth will complement other neutrino telescopes worldwide. Trident will use Earth itself as a shield to spot neutrinos coming through the planet. As Earth rotates daily, Trident can scan the entire sky without any blind spots. Deploying and operating Trident's massive array deep in the ocean presents huge engineering challenges. Thousands of vertical strings of light sensors must be positioned on the seafloor and connected to power and data transmission infrastructure. If succeeded, it will open a new window into the extreme universe and fundamental physics. Extreme weather events like typhoon are changing in dangerous ways. Over the past decade, typhoons have grown stronger overall, with more super typhoons hitting earlier each year. Chinese and American scientists have teamed up to study this trend using the latest weather data and the climate models. Their research revealed that super typhoons worldwide are occurring significantly earlier in the year, driven mostly by global warming. Historically, autumn has the highest frequency of super typhoons, but more recently, more and more are forming in summertime, like Super Typhoon Doksuri in July this year. The researchers warned this increase in the risk of compound disasters when super typhoons collide with extreme monsoons. These combined disasters cause damage far beyond any single event, severely challenging preparedness. The seasonal shift was only detected in super typhoons. Weak typhoons showed no change in timing. This contrast offered clues to why super typhoons are moving up. Rapid intensification is the key process distinguishing super typhoons. They typically undergo at least one period of explosive strengthening, with winds increasing over 50 miles per hour in 24 hours. Data analysis confirmed similar seasonal shift in rapid intensification events. The team analyzed seasonal verifications in atmospheric and oceanic factors influencing typhoon intensification. While atmospheric conditions showed no clear changes, ocean factors displayed pronounced seasonal shifts. Attribution studies using the latest climate models suggest human greenhouse emissions are the primary driver of the shifts. The evidence is clear: climate change is an urgent global issue. The super typhoon trends are a warning that cannot be ignored, and our future depends on how quickly we respond. And that is all for today's Threshold. We hope you liked this new section on science and technology in China. As usual, we welcome your feedback and thoughts.
And that does it for Threshold with Lisa. Let's now turn our attention to the Thinkers Forum, where Rhadhika Desai, a professor at the Department of Political Studies and director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group at the University of Manitoba in Canada, speaks on how the US dollar became the world's reserve currency and what can be done to move the world towards de-dollarization, which refers to countries reducing reliance on the US dollar as a reserve currency.
Let's focus on what I really want to talk about today, the internal contradictions of the dollar system. So first of all, the idea that national currencies can be world currencies is very problematic. First of all, domestically, even in the days when you had bullion and so on, gold and silver coins and so on, precious metal coins in the old times derived their value not from the metal content, but from the sovereign who minted these coins. That's why you always had these heads of sovereigns on these coins. The sovereign that minted them and promised to exchange them for the metal at face value. Because of course with circulating coins there was always wear and tear, people would clip coins and so on. So it was never assured that a given coin would actually contain the amount of precious metal that it was supposed to create. This therefore already contained the potential that in the future they would be replaced by paper money. Hence, of course, the Chinese genius in actually using and experimenting with paper money eons ago, centuries ago, millennia ago, I think. Secondly, internationally, since there is no world state, this is the important thing one has to understand. And I would argue there cannot be a world state in capitalism. There is no world money. And that is why, classically, in the 19th century, for example, only commodities like gold in the bullion form, not in coin form, worked as money. So national currencies can serve as world money only briefly and only through exceptional contrivances. So let's look at how the sterling became world money. The short answer to understanding this is to understand that sterling was not a national currency, it was an imperial currency. What do I mean by that? In the sterling system, which existed from the late 19th century until the First World War, and it was called the gold exchange standard because sterling was backed by gold, but the currency that was circulated was sterling in paper and so on. So in the sterling gold exchange standards, pounds could be, but nearly never were exchanged for gold. People just assumed that you could exchange, and that assumption held. It held because the Bank of England made sure that it would hold. So gold's price was only the benchmark of sterling's value. Indeed, the Bank of England actually operated the gold standard with very little gold. And it did so because on the one hand, she was an international creditor. The Bank of England essentially, and Britain generally, was a creditor to the rest of the world. That's one part. And secondly, her peculiar financial system, which was very short-termist and based on providing short-term commercial and frontier types of credit. So very important, not productive. It was diametrically opposed to the industrializers that challenged Britain, and these challenger systems like Germany, the German financial system was based at that time on providing long-term patient capital for industrial development. Britain's financial system was, by contrast, responsible for her industrial decline after 1870. Britain never reconfigured her financial system into a form that would actually aid her industrial recovery. The funds that Britain turned into her favored capital exports that provided the world with sterling liquidity were extracted from her non-settler colonies like British India, Caribbean, Africa. And British India was here preeminent, and no wonder British India was called the jewel in the crown. Britain extracted from British India home charges, gifts, and outright confiscated sterling surpluses that India earned as a result of being the second largest exporting economy in that time behind the United States. Indian economy never benefited from these. These capital exports went primarily, so Britain expropriated the surpluses and then exported them as capital to Europe and to Britain's settler colonies and the United States. So Europe, United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, which is the reason why these countries experienced the most powerful spurt of industrialization during this period. And in fact, Keynes points out, how did the Bank of England operate the gold standard with barely any gold? He said the Bank of England held less gold than the central bank of any other first-class power. But despite that, it still met its international engagement with promptness and certainty, which is why sterling was as good as gold, and few people demanded that sterling be exchanged for gold. And it was able to do this with promptness and certainty thanks to the efficient working of Britain's front line of defense, her international creditor position and her short-termist financial sector. Put together, they permitted Britain to counter gold claims for immediate payment with counterbalancing claims for equally immediate payments. If other people wanted money from Britain, Britain could demand money from other people on a short-term basis simply by raising the bank rate. The London money market was prompted to reduce international lending below the claims falling due. Remember, you cannot do this in a system of long-term finance. You can only do this in a system which is geared towards short-term finance. So, just to put it in a figurative form, you see the blue arrows, money flowing from the Caribbean, from Africa, from British India to England, and in the form of surpluses extracted, and then flowing outwards to North America, to Southern Africa, to Australia, to the Antipodes, and to Europe. And these were the financial flows that were the secret of the functioning of the sterling system, and that is why sterling was an instance of an imperial currency, not a national currency, serving as world money. And remember, British India at that time contained both Pakistan and Bangladesh, as well as present-day India. While a book on Indian currency and finance, written by Keynes in 1913, could be widely regarded as a primer of the gold standard, without British India, the gold standard could not have worked. Even with such imperial advantages, sterling had difficulties. Domestically, the increasingly organized working class resisted the periodic adjustments of high interest rates that the system needed, which directly led to decreases in wages and employment. Internationally, rival powers like Germany linked to gold in order to make their own currencies widely acceptable and therefore pose a challenge to sterling. And the gold standard was only sporadically and opportunistically used by other countries. The idea that everybody was sort of joined the gold standard and remained in it for good, for at least throughout this period, is not true. Finally, Britain's capital exports had nothing to do with her industrial prowess. Indeed, they marked her industrial decline. And if you read Indian currency and finance, it's practically a love letter to the sterling system. So look at how beautifully it operates. You just tweak a little bit here and a little bit there, and everything comes out beautifully, and so on. And it's only after he realized what the functioning of the sterling standard was doing to the British economy that he became increasingly a critic of the gold standard. And I wish that the United States were lucky enough to have economists like Keynes who can see what damage the operation of a similar system since the early 70s has been doing to the US economy. So why do we talk of the dollar succeeding sterling? It was at best, I would argue, a non-system. In this already multipolar world, without an empire, things could only be worse for the US dollar. It is ironic that it was the weakening of the sterling system that prompted, on the one hand, US ruling classes to aspire to replace the sterling system with a dollar system, but on the other hand, signified the working of factors, the weakening of imperialism, as signified by communism and decolonization, that would ensure that the dollar system would never be stable, it would always be unstable. Without vast tribute-paying colonies, the US could never export substantial amounts of capital. It never did. The alternative method of providing the world with liquidity was to run deficits, and this was subject to the Triffin dilemma. First articulated by the Belgian economist Robert Triffin, testifying before Congress in 1960, he said that essentially there was a contradiction in the dollar system, which was contingent on the fact that a national currency is playing the role of an international currency. He says a sustained flow of dollars and liquidity fueling global trade implied continuous and persistent deficits in the US, consequently eroding confidence in the dollar and its reserve currency role, leading to instability. As we all know, this instability eventually ensured that the Europeans would not accept dollars of decreasing value, and they said, forget your dollars, give us gold instead. And gold flowed out of the US system at such a high rate that barely 3 years were to pass between European currencies becoming convertible and the US discovering it did not have enough gold to run the system. So already by 1961, the United States had to organize a gold pool in order to prop up, in order to back the dollar. And it tried expedient after expedient over the next decade But within a decade, it was very clear that the gold backing could not work. The United States had to throw in the towel and say we can no longer exchange dollars for gold. And when many European countries were trying to see if they could try to have a new kind of international monetary system, the sort that Keynes had proposed at Bretton Woods. So the dollar is essentially functioning as the world's money without any gold backing. This did not save it from the triple dilemma. By the end of the 1970s, that gold was worth about $800 an ounce, which would be close to about $3,000 in today's money. And these deficits were, of course, due to military expenditures and deteriorating trade position. This ended the first phase of the dollar system. But what has happened since is essentially the United States authorities have organized massive increases in dollar-denominated financial activity. What does that do? You may not need the dollar, countries may not need the dollar for trade or investment purposes, but private investors are invited, which includes banks and so on, are invited to essentially hold their money in the dollar system, to engage and to profit from the activities of the dollar system. And these activities are of two types. Number one, predatory lending, not for productive purposes, predatory lending. And number two, speculation. So what are the main ones? 1970s dollar-denominated lending spree by US investing financial institutions lending to third world countries without any check, because they needed to make money on the vast quantities of money that were being deposited in the US dollars, in the US banks and Western banks by OPEC countries. They had to lend, they went off lending, and eventually there was a third world debt crisis. In the 1980s, the Japanese lent to the United States, which of course eventually sent the dollar so high that you had to, which was completely unsustainable, and the Plaza Accord had to bring the dollar down. The 1990s Clinton administration facilitated a drive to open capital accounts everywhere, leading to systematically to currency crises beyond the US in many European countries, Latin American countries, Russia, Sweden, you name it, and eventually you had the big 1997-1998 East Asian financial crisis. It was followed very quickly by the bursting of the dot-com bubble, which had been inflating throughout the mid to late 1990s. That was then followed by the inflation of the housing and credit bubble, which ended in, people call it the events of 2008, a global financial crisis. It was no such thing, it was a North Atlantic financial crisis, because the bulk of the money that went to these toxic securities at that time was what came, beyond the UK and the US. It came from European financial institutions, which is why also they suffered the most. That this laid the foundation of the 2010 Euro crisis, but we won't go into that. And today, after 2008, the era of easy monetary policy, low or zero interest rate policy, quantitative easing, etc., has actually led to what some people are calling the everything bubble. Practically every asset market is going nowhere but up, because simply there is so much money sloshing about the system that they have to find some assets to invest in. And how unhealthy this is, you will see by the fact that while the asset markets are going this way, every economic indicator of the productive economy is going in the opposite direction. This is a completely unsustainable situation. And this, by the way, the everything bubble was inflated, and the everything bust has also started over the last many years. A number of asset markets are deeply in trouble. Commercial real estate is only the latest, but there is private equity, there is many other assets, and US Treasury market has softened. So, since 1971, these financializations have been the problem. So essentially, even when it seemed to work after a fashion, say up to about the early 2000s, the US financial system was riddled with many problems. It required a very high degree of financialization, drawing money away from productive investment, both in the United States and elsewhere. Secondly, it undermined the productive economy, direct consequence of the first. Thirdly, it led to even more volatility and recurring financial crises, including for many third world countries, currency crisis, because their currencies would go up in value every time US investors decided that they wanted to bring money into Turkey or India or where have you. And then suddenly the US Federal Reserve, for example, raised interest rates, all this money would drain out, leaving a currency crisis for these countries for reasons that had nothing to do with the health of the country's economy. Completely extraneous. So you cannot really manage an economy for development under these circumstances. And today, of course, we are seeing, now we are in a position to see the long and enduring problems with the regular financial crisis. There is systematic undervaluation of other currencies. Obviously, the third world is the place where it is needed the most. Most of the capital is going in the other direction, from third world countries to first world countries. And finally, I should say last but not least, this system has led to wars. Several wars of recent times, from Libya to Iraq, have been at least partly a result of the fact that the rulers of these countries were exploring ways of leaving the dollar system, which they knew was not in the interest of the countries which they were leading. So what has been happening since 2008? People in the United States and the world were promised that there would be strict financial regulation. There has been nothing of the sort. Essentially, the Federal Reserve and other central banks have created the conditions for these institutions to continue in the same way as before, which is why we have today the everything bubble. But the contradictions of the dollar system are mounting. But the United States international investment position has been declining for a long time. Furthermore, as I pointed out, the 2008 crisis was not a global financial crisis, but a North Atlantic financial crisis. Up to that point, European financial institutions had been avidly putting money into the US financial system, but as we say in English, once bitten, twice shy. Having been really badly burned once, they are not going to go back into that. Now, the US Federal Reserve has, of course, supported swooning asset markets. It has done so because they have to. They have to support them if they want everybody to think that the US is a great place to come and speculate in asset markets and make money. So they have been supporting it with low or zero interest rate policies, quantitative easing, and lax financial regulation, and also this is the US Federal Reserve balance sheet. The Federal Reserve balance sheet was at about $1 trillion right up until the 2008 financial crisis. Then it went from 1 to a little over $2 trillion. Then it kind of remained there, but with quantitative easing and whatnot, it rose to about $4 trillion. Then in recent times with the pandemic and the vast, the tsunami of liquidity which the Federal Reserve has visited upon the system, it went to nearly $9 trillion. And given how soft the treasury market is, the Federal Reserve is going to have to buy more of these reserves. So in these ways, the Federal Reserve has supported swooning asset markets. But now, as I've already said, the return of inflation, which is itself a result of its unproductive predatory economy, decline of imperial power, is putting the Federal Reserve on the horns of a dilemma. The US will not opt to tackle inflation in the best possible way, which is to improve supply, to essentially say if the private sector will not supply the things that are needed, whose prices are going up, we will have public enterprise doing that. But this would be too much like socialism. You can't have that. And as I say, the removal of the debt ceiling has itself resolved the political crisis, but it has laid the foundation of a new debt crisis. And stories like this are multiplying. They are appearing in the mainstream financial press, where people are saying that the treasury market is not doing well. People are not buying treasuries. The treasury market does not have the depth and the breadth, etc. What is the US going to do? So, but this is interesting as well. People, the discourse that is generated by Western institutions and so on, they lead you to believe that China and Japan are essentially holding up the US Treasury market. The bulk of US debt is held by US entities and institutions, not by China or or Japan or any other country. So essentially, what we are looking at is a situation in which the financial crisis, the bursting of the everything bubble, is already underway. There are any number of triggers. They can be economic, financial, social, political, geopolitical, that can trigger a knockdown crisis. And this knockdown crisis is going to very seriously set back the dollar. Why is it that people don't understand this? Because we have an academic industry based primarily in the United States, headed by people like Charles Kindleberger and his modern-day successors, who continue to talk up the dollar. The hegemony literature's very function has been to naturalize the idea of the currency of one country, a dominant country serving as the world's currency. And every setback the dollar has, they produce some new justification as to why this isn't a setback at all. Everything and its contrary is taken as a sign of US dollar strength. If the US dollar is strong, they say, oh, well, look how strong the US dollar is. If it weakens, they say, oh, look, the US dollar is weak, but everybody still wants the US dollar. So this is the kind of discourse. The Triffin dilemma, it is like they have an omerta, the old Sicilian pledge among families. You will not talk about certain things. They will never talk about the Triffin dilemma. Instead, they say the dollar, if worse come to worse, they say, well, the dollar is not doing well, but who is going to replace it? They say there is no successor, so the dollar will continue. But as we will see in a minute, there doesn't need to be a successor. In fact, there should not be a successor. So, and of course, they also say that RMB, it can the RMB be a successor, they say, but the Chinese authorities are unable and unwilling to internationalize the renminbi. RMB is being internationalized, that's fine, and it will be internationalized. I have no doubt it will play a very important role, but it should not be internationalized on the pattern of the US dollar. If it is, China will essentially suffer the same consequences as Britain and the United States have suffered vis-a-vis their productive economies.
Well, here is where we part ways on this week's episode of China Now. As usual, I hope that you had a very good time and you have been adequately educated and informed about the happenings in China and the rest of the world. Please do not hesitate to send in your comments, your thoughts, your feedback and suggestions for the coming episodes of the show. My name is Makiza Micheline Latifa, and I'll see you same time next week.